Good evening, everyone. How are you? You all look like you are well, or at least you have smiles on your face. Even if there are hardships in your life, you're bringing a happy face to this place. So thank you for doing that. My name is Joel Lohr. I am president of Hartford Seminary. This is a beautiful place to be in a world that seems to be so in need of Hartford Seminary. We are blessed to have you here. I'd like to thank Professor Winter for bringing some of her students here tonight. Thank you for being here. As well as some of my students are here for my class. Good to see you. I see a few trustees, a few friends, former board chairs. Nice to see you, and some faculty. Tonight is a special night for me in some ways because the lecture that you are about to, or the panel that you're going to about to hear, it came about because the guest speaker today, Anthony Ladon, Professor Ladon, is a friend of mine. And our history goes back to Vancouver, where we both studied together, and then to Durham, UK. We didn't know each other that well in Vancouver. But when you end up in another place like England, and you don't know anyone, and you find out that you were at the same school, because we were both in Durham, we thought, we've got to get together and talk about what it's like being here in England. And so we became very good friends. And Anthony and I began our PhDs. I think you started a year before me, although I did my master's degree there. And so at any rate, we were there for the same time. And Anthony was working on historical Jesus studies. I will say, we'll get an introduction from Professor Mosher, but I will say that he is a modest person. He will not toot his own horn, but he is a well-known Jesus scholar, editor of one of the most important journals on the historical Jesus. He was instrumental in changing how we talk about Jesus in terms of a remembered Jesus in relation to a historical Jesus. He probably won't talk a lot about that tonight, but he has made some really important headway in that discussion along with his supervisor. His name was Professor James Dunn, or Jimmy Dunn. At any rate, I'm just delighted that Anthony is here. I'm delighted that you are here. Please don't screw this up, Anthony. They now know you're my friend.
No promises.
We have academic freedom here, and we're proud of having a variety of viewpoints, and I hope what he says is stimulating for our minds and our hearts and our souls. And with that, I'm going to pass over to our moderator, Professor Lucinda Mosher. Why don't we welcome her?
I work from Florida. I teach online, so it's a rare thing these days that I get to be here in person, and it's quite lovely to be in this space and see faces, some of whom are familiar to me, and the rest of you I hope to meet after we move into casual conversation. So, tonight we have our guest speaker, Anthony Ladon, is Associate Professor of New Testament at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. He's the author or editor of 13 books, including The Historiographical Jesus, Historical Jesus, What Can We Know and How Can We Know It, and Jesus, A Beginner's Guide. Anthony serves as the executive editor of the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. Alongside Jesus research, he is keenly interested in Jewish-Christian dialogue. Responding to him will be Hossein Kamali, Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and holder of the Imam Ali Chair for Shia Studies and Dialogue among Islamic legal schools at Hartford Seminary. His most recent book is A History of Islam in 21 Women. His areas of study include Quranic studies, Shia studies, Islamic studies, and interfaith interpretive traditions, among others. Now, in the Hartford Seminary course, Images of Jesus, let me get this to go back the way it's supposed to be there. We have a course called Images of Jesus in Christian and Muslim Sacred Writings, which it is my great pleasure to teach. And in this course, we consider Jesus from many angles. We read what the Bible and the Quran have to say about Jesus, of course, but we also consider the images of Jesus to be found in scholarly and devotional writings of many sorts. Hence, we read a range of authors, some of them committed Christians or Muslims, others avowed agnostics, a few Jewish scholars of the New Testament, and there may be other categories. Thus, we learn that Jesus studies includes the theological category of Christology, the study of the person and work of Jesus, who and what he is, what he did and does. It includes literary critical analysis of scriptural texts. It includes the compilation and consideration of non-scriptural Jesus material of many genres. It may involve the visual arts. And it definitely includes historical critical method and projects like the Jesus Seminar. Our guest, Anthony LaDon, has quite a lot to say about the assumptions and methods of Jesus studies, particularly scholarship accepting this search for the historical Jesus. In his book on that topic, he challenges his readers to ask better questions and to reconsider what historical actually means. In his talk tonight, he will focus on who is and who should be doing this work, or, to put it another way, who is doing this work and deserves more notice. Anthony.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful to be here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. In the brief time I have with you, I want to talk to you about some power dynamics, academic power dynamics, that I've observed in my chosen discipline, which is historical Jesus research. And maybe you've noticed something similar in the worlds and communities that you live in. I'd be really interested to hear how what I say tonight relates to your interests. Some of these power dynamics relate to ethnicity, but not all of them. Some of them relate to faith, matters of faith, and geography. Before going further, I need to make two disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that I come to you with lots of questions and not many answers. And so my hope is that maybe in conversation, you can help me think of better questions, to hone the questions that I have. I am very interested in starting a conversation, and I think that sometimes it's best to start these kinds of conversations by finding the most helpful questions rather than coming to the table with all of the answers. All right, so that's my first disclaimer. My second disclaimer relates to the way that I look. Because I find that some people are uncomfortable because the way that I look doesn't necessarily match the way that I talk. And so I just want to make sure from the very beginning that I clear things up just at the start. My ethnicity is whatever makes you feel most comfortable. No, if my parents or my 5 siblings were here, they would all very vociferously, with lots of hand motions, tell you that we are Italian. Now, that is true. However, it's probably more important to know that for our collective identity, we're Northern California. All right, so that probably is a different sort of Italian than you might find in other places in the world. And California is actually where I start this particular topic. I began my interest in this particular topic about 8 years ago. And it was when I was teaching a class much like your class. It was a class called Portraits of Jesus. Now, Portraits of Jesus is the kind of class that progressive institutions took over from other classes and reframed, right? So maybe in the 50s these were called Gospels, and then maybe in the 90s these were changed to the historical Jesus, and then more recently we've changed these to Portraits of Jesus or Images of Jesus. And this was just the perfect class for me. I was very excited about this class, and the way that I taught it was that I did what a lot of historical Jesus people do, is they try to make Jesus relatable to really a post-Enlightenment context. And For whatever it's worth, the students in this class were mostly white, between the ages of 17 and 30, and I got into the Gospels, and I started teaching Jesus, and like many Northern Californians, I found that what makes Jesus interesting is the interesting things that he said. So what makes Jesus interesting in the culture that I grew up in is the interesting things that Jesus said. If you want to talk about the things Jesus did or the significance of who he was, you'd have to go in a church, but that's not something that we talk about outside of church. All right? So we just opened the Gospels with my students, and we immediately were confronted with questions about being born of a virgin, and what do we do with that? How do we deal with that? We talk about stories like taking a very small amount of food and feeding a multitude. What do we do with stories like this? And my students, understandably, were getting hung up on these things. If we're talking about Jesus as a historical figure, what do we do with these stories that look like fables? And so I employed techniques that are very well known in historical Jesus research. I started talking about comparative mythology. We talk about the infancy narratives of Jesus. Let's look at other infancy narratives. Let's look at other births of great figures in this context. Or sometimes the stories would become a metaphor. So Jesus feeds a multitude with a very small amount of resources. This speaks to God's abundance. This is what's being taught in the text, that God's great abundance is, in many ways, the spiritual food from the divine is never ending. Something like that. Or we take topics like Jesus being able to heal with just a touch or a word, and maybe this tells us something about the way that we should think about healthcare in our modern context. So these things can become metaphors, they can become myths, they can become spiritualized, and these were techniques that worked well for my students in Northern California. And then I took a job in Dayton, Ohio, and my classrooms changed dramatically. Okay? And I noticed that some of these techniques were not working very well for me. I was spending a lot of time trying to explain why the ancient mind would perceive the world in such a way, and what these stories might mean if, of course we don't take these things literally, right? And my students were not very interested in those discussions. And I'm noticing also, at the same time, that my students, the town in which United is 93% African American. And my students are maybe a little over half African American, and many of the other half are from the global South. And then I have, a number of rural white folk, but rural white folk with what we call renewalist sensibilities. Renewalist is a word that we use to combine charismatic and Pentecostals. So these are people in the community that regularly speak in tongues, engage in healing, are interested in prophecy. And guess what they're not interested in? They're not interested in me demythologizing Jesus. In fact, they're kind of not impressed with Jesus. Because what Jesus does in the Gospels, they just saw last Sunday. In their lived experience, not for all of my students, for many of my students, in their lived experience, Jesus just makes sense. Jesus already makes sense. All right. So now I find myself living in two different worlds. I live in a world of historical Jesus research, which is almost exclusively white. It was developed in the European Enlightenment. It was developed in Germany, and it's maintained by an almost exclusively white corner of academia. And then I live in my classroom, which is decidedly not that. So how do I negotiate these two things? To my students, their Jesus isn't the Jesus that was constructed by white academia. And I'm feeling this acutely. The rules created in the European Enlightenment, developed in Germany, and maintained by an almost exclusively white subset of the scholarship, function as walls for my students indeed. Just to illustrate the point. All right, so you might have seen books about Jesus on bookshelves. There are lots of them. All right, there are 10 a year, and going back in the 90s, there were probably 30 a year. It became something of a cottage industry. And in all of those books, we have 2 monographs by African Americans. Only 2. Here they are. Right? So 2. 1949, Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. 70 years since this book. And then my colleague Aubrey Hendricks. Politics of Jesus a few years ago. My black students love Jesus. And yet, the historical Jesus is walled in. The conversation that we're having in historical Jesus, in many ways, is not hospitable. So, here are a few of the assumptions that go into what mainstream historical Jesus scholars think that I think might serve as obstacles for my students. Number 1, and I should say this. I wonder if some of these obstacles might have analogs as we welcome people of all faiths. I wonder if some of the things I'm noticing as barriers between Jesus scholars and my students might also be relevant to talking about Islamic studies in Jesus. Here's an assumption: the divine intervention doesn't happen. That's just the assumption. I had a journal, and either the authors for my journal are either come in with this assumption, or they're writing for people with this assumption. And I explain this to my students this way. I say, look, historical Jesus scholars are not necessarily Christian. There are people from other faiths. There are Jewish scholars. There are people of no faith. And we need to be able to sit down at a table and make sense of the Jesus tradition together. And so we can't just assume that these supernatural stories convey what happened in the real world. And that makes sense to my students. And yet, I wonder how diverse that table actually is. Second assumption. Historical Jesus scholars are heterodox creatures. We are heterodox creatures. We like alternative narratives. We seek them out. Now, from a faith perspectives normally come to a figure like Jesus with an official narrative. Whether that narrative comes from a sacred text or comes from a creed, there's an official narrative. Even with the Christian tradition, even when there's 4 narratives side by side, we would prefer them to sort of work together and be one single official narrative. But historical Jesus researchers aren't interested in the official narrative. In fact, sometimes we go out of our way to poke and bend, and find our ways around the official narrative for the sake of creativity and because we also like to sell books. So that's another thing that may or may not be a barrier. We like alternative narratives. Historical Jesus researchers love to talk about methodology. We love to talk about methodology. We love to talk about methods. We like to figure out what criteria should be used and shouldn't be used, and which parts of our assumptions come from German Romanticism, and which part of our assumptions come from American evangelicalism. And we like to talk. I wrote a book with the word historiographical in the title. This is not welcoming. This is not a welcoming thing. A colleague of mine, Esau McCauley, who's been helping me work on this topic, is an African-American scholar who primarily works in Paul. But he recently wrote in an essay that we published. He asked the question, and I'll just leave it open. He said, is the choice to endlessly discuss methodology an incidence of white privilege? And he just leaves it as a question mark. He doesn't answer it. I think that's a really interesting question. This is not something that Howard Thurman would have done, for instance. I suspect that these assumptions push voices of color out of our conversations. And I wonder if these assumptions will need to be questioned in order to make our field more hospitable to Muslim scholarship. And before turning the microphone to Professor Kamali, let me suggest a few other obstacles that might be relevant. So these are assumptions that historical Jesus scholars make. Historical Jesus scholars generally begin with the fact of the crucifixion and explain away the virgin birth as myth. Historical Jesus scholars generally use the New Testament as a lens for Jesus, thus making New Testament Greek a prerequisite. Historical Jesus scholars generally sideline the authority of faith texts in favor of the authority of social scientific research. So in addition to the three assumptions that I mentioned previously, I wonder if these assumptions might also lack a certain hospitality. Okay, I'm almost done. Finally, I want to say a word about teaching Jesus specifically to Christians. My seminary, my students at my seminary are 100% identify with Christianity. I started by talking about trying to make Jesus relatable to my audience. I used to try to make Jesus relatable, to make him make sense to people with Enlightenment sensibilities. But I found that there is a virtue in allowing Jesus to be strange. As my students encounter Jesus as a stranger, maybe they will learn to embrace other kinds of strangers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Earlier today, attending chapel in this same building, I kept thinking about this evening and this event. Just as I sang along with fellow members of the Hartford Seminary, with Susan, David, Joel, MT, and other friends, other colleagues, we sang together with Najib. Within me, within you, the life of Christ appeared. Within me, within you, the light of Christ appeared. Of course, I can relate to these lines. I'm not Italian. And I'm not from Northern California. I'm in New York. Sometimes. See, identity is fluid.
Yes.
As a Muslim, I'm familiar with the 25 verses or ayahs in the Quran that speak of Jesus in no uncertain terms as the Word of God, the Messiah, blessed where he is, and blessing wherever he goes. For example, Ayah 45 in Surah 3, Al Imran, reminds us of the time when the angels said, "O Mary, truly God gives you the good tidings of a word from him. His name, the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, shines in the world and in the hereafter, and he stands close." إذ قالت الملائكة يا مريم إن الله يبشرك بكلمة منه اسمه المسيح عيسى ابن مريم وجيها في الدنيا والآخرة ومن المقربين. Recalling this ayah and several others, and of course the entire surah named after Mary in the Quran, I still couldn't help but wonder what my contribution could possibly be to the quest of the historical Jesus. Still, I thought to myself that to begin my presentation, I should draw your attention to a few lines from an old Christmas song. The song belongs to the genre of African American spirituals and is called Sweet Little Jesus Boy. Familiar?
Yeah.
I highly recommend that you listen to Mahalia Jackson, the Queen of Gospel, singing Sweet Little Boy Jesus. Sweet little Jesus boy, born a long time ago, sweet little holy child, we didn't know who you were. In my humble opinion, we still don't know who you are. Long before African American Christians gave voice to soulful songs, such as the song of Sweet Little Jesus Boy, the so-called people of color have been close to the way of Jesus. Indeed, way before so-called white people came along to speak for Jesus in Europe, so-called people of color were there. And of course, I want to problematize these concepts, people of color and white people. These are themselves very much constructed ideas. Literally centuries before whiteness was invented, sometime during the 19th century, these people were there. And this is an important point. For example, in what Jack Miles, author of a highly engaging book on Christ, calls a subtle but powerful literary move, the Gospel of Luke introduces Christianity's first convert out of Palestine as a black eunuch. It is worth adding and recalling that even before that, one of the three magi, one of the three wise men, or kings, who visited the infant Jesus on the night of his birth in a manger, accompanied by the shepherds and angels, is sometimes depicted as a black man. Right? We have that in medieval art. These may be described as historic facts, or if you prefer, remembered facts. However, perhaps the more important question should not be who got there first, but who got it right. And I would state here, hoping that we all agree on this, that basing religious understanding on racial history is not right. It's wrong. Racism, any form of privileging one race over others, has already inflicted irreparable damage in human history. So the harmful obsession with race must be dismantled and discarded. And I think this is what we are here for, and talking about it in a very specific context, and I'm sure we agree on this. So let me go directly to the announced title or theme of this event, Seeing Jesus in Color. Let me point out that in Islam, Jesus is spoken of neither as a person of color nor as white. These terms were not part of the worldview within which the Islamic tradition took shape. And I would suggest, perhaps in the form of a question, that in classical Christianity, these ideas were not formulated either. Black, white, etc. The idea is expressed in the same surah or chapter which I cited earlier. And this is my I'm going to make a suggestion here. This is ayah 59 of the same surah. That goes like this. The case of Jesus before God is like the case of Adam. He created him from dust, then said to him, be, and he was. إِنَّ مَثَلَ عِيسَى عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلَ آدَمَ خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونُ. Let's focus on the first part only. The positive comparing of the creation of Jesus to that of Adam. Was Adam white? Was Adam a person of color? Are these meaningful questions? I'd answer both these questions in the negative. I won't say they're meaningless, even though that would be my position. But at least I will answer them in the negative. Skin color, let alone race, was not part of the narrative of Adam's creation, nor of the creation of Jesus. Race is not an element in the worldview of the Quran. It was not an element either in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament either. Maybe we can discuss this, but I don't think the concept, the 19th century concept of race, developed by such racist people as Gobino and then the Nazi Party in the 20th century, didn't exist. And I won't cite this for you by naming other racists. Okay. So, genealogy, yes, but race, no. Genealogy, not. However, in the case of Adam, there is no prior or precedent genealogy either. Should we focus on the genealogy of Jesus? Well, that is part of the New Testament, right? That is talked about. Adam transcended genealogy. And I think in a very important sense, Jesus transcended genealogy as well. By likening the case of Jesus to that of Adam, we could conclude that genealogy is simply transcended in his case as well. The divine message should never be tied to such fake or flawed concepts. Okay, I want to keep this short so that we can have a meaningful discussion. So I want to point something out, again, in the form of a question, something we can talk about. And say that the genealogical framework of the Abrahamic prophethood allows us to be more inclusive. Should we decide to commit ourselves to inclusivity? Should we decide to commit ourselves to inclusivity? And this is a decision that we have to make. It's not to be taken for granted. It's a commitment. It's like having faith itself. It's not to be taken for granted. It's a commitment. Once we do make such a commitment, we may acknowledge not just one, but at least a few discourses within the shared Abrahamic paradigm. I'm using the word paradigm here in the same sense that Thomas Kuhn introduced it as a technical term in his seminal Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Yes, the term paradigm is ambiguous, and it has been recognized as such ever since Kuhn introduced it in the 1960s. Nevertheless, it's a useful concept for our thinking. We commonly limit ourselves to the three living traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam when we talk about the Abrahamic tradition or the Abrahamic paradigm. But we should also keep in mind that historically there were many more traditions. And this is important. It's not just Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. There are many forgotten traditions also, right? And they are similarly Abrahamic. And the Abrahamic tradition, the Abrahamic paradigm shared by these three religions and more, draws on divine agency, divine commands, miracles, reward and punishment, among other conceptual and narrative points of reference. I think we need this paradigm to advance our discussion of the historical Jesus, or the quest for Jesus, or to discuss any interfaith topic. I'm paraphrasing a sentence from you that I picked from one of your papers. Indeed, the Abrahamic paradigm can serve as a foundation, not to say the foundation, component of interfaith dialogue. I reworked the sentence. However, there exists an important substantive challenge to this Abrahamic paradigm, and this is important for our discussion. Even within the Abrahamic paradigm, different and sometimes mutually contradictory narratives exist. No doubt, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim narratives on Jesus do not always converge. And this is an important point to emphasize, not to evade. Right? This is an important point. Beginning with Josephus, the Romanized Jewish historian, and later in the Talmud, we encounter some views expressed about Jesus that come across as utterly unacceptable to present advocates of interfaith dialogue. Right? And I'm not only talking about Christians who may be offended by such polemics. When I read them, I get kind of thrown off. Maybe some are not, but personal feeling. This is why I had a problem with talking about the ruin of Jesus. So I thought we have to change the wording. Words matter. You're in the business of language, right? Words matter to us. So in the Islamic tradition, one cannot find anything comparable to such insults to the historical Jesus. Still, historical and theological points of divergence do exist. Fundamental points of difference exist. Even grave difference. But I think, and I'm proposing, and I'm hoping that we all agree on this, that's what brings us here, that difference, even grave difference, may sometimes serve as a basis for dialogue. Right? In The Quest of Jesus, the renowned New Testament scholar, Jimmy Dunn, you mentioned your colleague, has observed that in the closing decades of the 20th century, the most helpful advance in the life of Jesus research was the recognition that the quest must primarily have in view Jesus the Jew and the clearer and firmer grasp of the consequences. I would take another step and suggest that expanding our narrative base by adding elements from the Muslim tradition may also be highly fruitful as well. It's not just embracing the idea of Jewishness in early Christianity, but alternative, you talked about alternative narratives. Expanding our narrative, our repertoire of narratives is extremely important to us. Any such integration of narratives, potentially inconsistent as they may be historically as well as theologically, would have to go beyond embracing one position as orthodoxy and another as heresy. Serving as guides to historical and theological developments, so-called orthodoxies and heresies, both in the plural, would have to be represented and engaged. We cannot simply dismiss the Docetists as heretics, or the Nestorians as heretics, the Monophysites as heretics. There are many positions that we need to engage, not to accept, but to engage. Similarly, the Muslim position, the Jewish position, the various Jewish positions, the various Muslim positions, there is variety, there is a spectrum of positions, that we need to engage them all to advance this conversation. So let me end my call to the necessity for expanding our narrative repertoire by emphasizing the need for historical and theological humility in speaking about what we have been speaking about. Sweet little Jesus boy, born a long time ago. Sweet little holy child. We didn't know who you were. And I still think we don't know who he was. Thank you very much, and I look forward.
We started with power dynamics and ended with sweet little Jesus boy and covered amazing territory in between. I think the first question should be between you. And do you have a question for Hossein?
Well, I must say that I've learned I'm intrigued by this statement you've made, and I'm tempted to quote it. The statement was something like this: it's not important. It's not as important who got there first, but who got it right. Right? I like this a lot, actually, and this is something that relates to one of the issues that Jesus historians wrestle with, and that is, just because a tradition is earlier, is it therefore privileged?
Very good point.
Right. So in many cases, what we'll do in Jesus research is we'll say, well, here's what Mark says. Mark is written around 70. Here's what Matthew says. Matthew's written a decade or so later. Of course, Mark is closer to the historical Jesus because it came first. And yet, there are many cases that I think that Matthew comes along and says, yeah, I guess that's okay, but it would have been better if you said it like this. Or it would make more sense to me if you said it like this. Or in some cases, Mark, you don't know what you're talking about. It has to be this. And I'm wondering if there isn't virtue to be found there as well as we compare New Testament tradition with Hadith or Quranic tradition as well.
Well, I think the regular standard answer would be, of course, the Islamic narrative is a corrective. But I'm not going to say that, right? Of course not. Because that would contradict what I was saying. It's for being inclusive with our narratives. But that is the standard answer that one gets. And the answer comes, ironically, from people who value the originary history of Islam and the very point of origin when it all began in the 7th century. So that is the irony, that is the contradiction in that position, that privileges the earlier statement. But when it comes to Christianity, it says, well, we are later, but we are right. We got it right. So there is always a problem with literalism. No literalist is truly honest in their literalism, I think. And this is one of those cases. No, this privileging of the origin is never enough, because our access to any origin is mediated by our memory and by our history, by our understanding of history. So it doesn't work. The earlier document may be good for people who edit texts. Yeah, there is an old text and they do that. But in the history of ideas, that's a very weak position. So let me share a personal experiment that I used to do. Do I have time?
You do.
I used to teach a course called Asian Humanities. It was meant to extend the introduction to the Western canon. So this was after students took classes about about Homer. They read the Odyssey, they read Virgil, they read Shakespeare, they read everything, and then we had this other class called Asian Humanities. So what did the Asians have? Right? I would read the Bible with them, the Quran with them, Hindu scriptures with them, among other things. So one of the texts I gave them to read was the creation narrative known as the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is, to the best of my knowledge, the oldest creation narrative that has reached us, at least in from the Mediterranean tradition. And it begins with, it has this 6 days in it. It has this, the sea, the sweet sea, the salty sea, they don't mix. And of course, and there is the Noah's flood in the other story. The flood is not in the Enuma Elish, it's in another very ancient story. So I asked my students, did the Bible plagiarize the Enuma Elish? And of course, to some, the answer was yes, of course. Right? It comes later. This is an earlier text. Obviously, it. Because that is part of the Orientalist polemic against the Quran that comes after the Hebrew Bible, and so whenever there's a story of Abraham or Jesus or Abraham or Moses or the Israelite prophets, if it says something that is different, that differs from what we find in the Hebrew Bible or in the Talmud exposition of it, this is everywhere in Orientalist writing. The Muslims got it wrong. They didn't know, right? There is abundant literature on this. And I would problematize this, and I say, look, when you look at the Enuma Elish, this is about gods fighting each other, and Marduk emerging from that war. The Bible begins with the one and only God. There's a very important difference. It's a later text, but the discourse is different. It refers to a story that may be known, but totally changes it. So these narratives that we have, they are different, more important than who got it right, in the sense of the Roncaean view of history as it really happened, is that these narratives serve a theological, sometimes polemical purpose. So when it is stated in the Quran, also in the New Testament, by the way, in one instance, that Jesus worked on Shabbat. And people said, okay, why do you work? He said, my Father doesn't stop working. Right? That's familiar? In the Quran, very explicitly, God does not take a nap. So where does this come from? This is a response to the understanding of the Hebrew Bible, that God created the world in 6 days and then rested the other day. This is a theological statement. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. He doesn't sleep. This is a theological point. This is not just a historical point. And this is what I mean by extending our narratives. It is not just what came earlier, but what makes sense. And that's what I mean by who got it right. Not correspondence with facts. Because by say facts are remembered, memory is reconstructive, as we know. So I think in our studies, in interfaith studies, it is important to engage earlier as well as later narratives. Not only the Synoptic Gospels and John, but also the so-called Gnostic Gospels, the so-called Apocrypha. In that way, we extend our repertoire. And we understand why it is that for the Armenian church, right, the Apocrypha are part of the canon. So what Catholicism and Protestantism consider non-canonical, for the Armenians it's part of the canon. And I think, I'm not suggesting to extend the canon, because I understand what is involved. But in the university, we do things, right? We bring things onto the table for discussion.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Anthony. There must be upcoming scholars in Jesus studies, scholars of color. Are they taking new approaches, and what might some of those approaches be?
This is still very difficult. When I took over the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, it was 30 white scholars, 29 men. And we've been able to diversify over the last 3 years to a certain extent. Dr. Hendricks came on our board just in the last year. I can't say that there are, that I know of PhD dissertations that are doing something with historical Jesus research. Sometimes our journal gets an essay from African nations, students and scholars in Africa, and these these essays don't normally do very well in peer review. It's still very much a difficulty. So in the last year, what we did was, because it was Howard Thurman's 70th anniversary of the publication of this book, what we did was we brought in 7 essayists who primarily specialize in African American studies. And we had each essay do a reflection of Thurman. And my guest editor, Esau McCauley, who I mentioned earlier, he was able to spearhead the study, and I think some interesting things came out of that project. But it just very, very seminal. It's just very early strides and very small strides. Predominantly, Jesus Studies is almost exclusively white, and so this is still a major problem.
Plenty of room for growth. I'm wondering what questions you might have. Do we have a question? Yes. Yeah, there it is. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm not going to know names, so I'll just point. Yeah.
I have 2 comments. First one, there is a huge project from Langham, not mainly about Jesus, but on biblical interpretation. And they produced at least like 2 volumes. I know. One of them is African commentary.
Yes.
And it has several articles and commentaries about African.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, because African American scholarship is very prominent in biblical studies generally. In fact, womenist studies are very important, making strides in all kinds of areas of biblical studies. But for whatever reason, Jesus Studies it remains somewhat exclusive. But thank you for telling me about that research.
The other one is the Arab commentary.
Sorry?
Arab commentary.
Okay.
And this is also from Langham. And this is open my second comment. So when we talk about Arabs or Christians or Muslims who speak Arabic about Jesus, historical Jesus studies, it is quite complicated.
Oh, yeah.
So in Islamic studies or Muslims in countries like Egypt, they are selective how they use historical studies. So at a certain point to use it to prove Jesus as Lord God, but at the same time they do not prefer it when we talk about Jesus' birth or Jesus as a prophet or miracles. But my question is about other issue. There is a huge, I believe, publication about intertextuality. I think also it is from STL, Society of American Literature, and it is using in somehow how the stories from the Bible, including the history of Jesus and other issues, and how it could be related to Quran or Sunnah or things like this, to have a different approach than what we used to think as Christians about some other stories, and to give some aspects we may not think about it. And it was popular at the early stages of Christianity, 6th century of Christianity. How do you think about this could help us in developing our understanding from other people or different races or nations to have different understanding from the life?
Well, I think that the entryway that you're suggesting is a good one. I think actually, if we begin with the study of intertextuality, I think that it would be great, because we could have a method, a pre-framed method, which is actually really important to start with. And we already know how to do this because we compare Jesus to Talmudic tradition. We compare Jesus to going the other way to prophetic tradition. So we know how to do this well. But it's unfortunately, in comparing with Hadith or Qumranic tradition, for some reason we have not applied that discipline yet. But I think your suggestion of beginning with the methods established by scholars who already know how to deal with intertextuality would be a great place to start.
Joel?
I'm going to try using it.
So if you mentioned being on this board, and 29 of the 30 editorial board members were white, and I think you said men, but maybe you didn't, I can't remember.
30 white, 29 male.
30 white, 29 male.
Yeah.
So if, kind of what you're describing, we have these, it's clear that something is keeping persons of color or women out of this particular discipline, at least as it's being constructed in this very kind of small way. And Historical Jesus Studies has some, you laid out some of these rules, but there are very clear rules that need to be obeyed if you want to enter that conversation or if you want to get published in the Historical Jesus journals. And is there any reflection other than what you've done for us tonight on, if no one else is entering this conversation other than us white men, is there something wrong with our discipline? And I think that's what you're doing here tonight.
Yeah.
But can you talk to us about that? Because if no one else is getting in,
Yeah.
and no one else gets to have a voice, and it's kind of continues to reinforce these structures and these powers, and I'm not trying to overuse that, but you know what I'm getting at. So
Yeah.
Are you the only, has anyone said, I think we've screwed up?
Yeah.
Look we've been doing this a long time and we still have not let anyone else in. Like no one else
Yeah.
is getting in. So are there others trying to reframe this conversation?
I was talking with Dr. Hendricks about this very question. And so the question, there's two ways to get at this. We could ask the question, what are we doing wrong? What sort of walls have we created wittingly or unwittingly? Right, so we should know about those if they're there, and I think I've probably talked about a few of them. The other way at it, and this is something that Dr. Hendricks told me, is he said, well, it's not necessarily that the discipline is doing something necessarily wrong. It's just something that's not very interesting. It's just not something that's very interesting. It's when Thurman begins this book, he says that there's been lots and lots of different Jesuses that have come along. A lot of interpreters that have endeavored to write a book about Jesus or present a portrait of Jesus, but not many seem useful for a people whose back is up against the wall. Right? And that was his start. That's his starting point. And I think that is in 1949. I think that's his way of nodding to the tradition of historical Jesus research that didn't seem very useful. Right? So the question is not necessarily how to make Jesus interesting, but how to make Jesus useful. Right? So and hard questions. Hard questions.
Najib.
I don't have a question, but I have two small comments, if I may. One, from my reading of contemporary Islamic studies, I can claim, I'm not Islamicist, but I can claim that there is a parallel Islamic quest of the historical Muhammad and Islamic quest of the historical Quran one can speak about. That was also in Germany. When I read, just an example, when I read Tor André's book on Muhammad and how Muhammad narrative can be read as a narrative of a psychological biography. I remember Schweitzer, Albert Schweitzer, reading Jesus also psychologically. That's just an example. So I think one can find actually a historical quest scholarship in contemporary Islamic studies. And for the historical quest of Quran, you are in Ohio, you said, right? Indiana, forgive me, I'm not expert. Indiana is not far from you, right? So Notre Dame, there's a scholar there called Gabriel Said Reynolds, who is into the quest of the historical Quran. I think conversation between you and him would be really useful.
Thank you.
Just another comment. I think, I teach a course on the historical quest of Jesus, or here in Hartford Seminary. And I try to keep myself updated on the field and what's happening in it. I'm not expert in the field, but I read it, I'm educated about it. My impression is that it's a dead field. Dead field.
Oh, it's
dead. Because it no more speaks about anything historical in relation to Jesus or to Christology. And that concern about coloring Jesus or decoloring Jesus is itself non-historical question. It's itself non-historical methodology. It imposes on Jesus anachronistically methods which the historical quest itself claimed that it is liberating scholarship from. So I can understand why people from different colors are not there. I cannot understand why it is white, but I can understand the ideology that led to that. And I can understand why people, because simply to speak about Jesus in terms of colors is non-historical by itself.
You had a question. Yeah. This mic's right behind you.
Just to follow up, and I really do appreciate your insight on that. I would be very interested in learning about the quest for the historical Quran, if for no other reason that just that language seems to be borrowed from my field of study, and so there seems to be an intentional parallel there. That interests me greatly. I think that the title that I originally suggested for for my paper was "How Whiteness Ruined Jesus," and I was going to start with the first the interpretations of a Nordic Jesus for missionary work to the Vikings. And all of a sudden Jesus becomes this warrior poet, and the disciples become these loyal warrior followers. And so almost as soon as Jesus becomes white, he becomes a warrior. And I thought that'd be an interesting thing to bring in. But how whiteness ruined Jesus is problematic because, as my friend pointed out to me, it presupposes that Jesus has been ruined. Jesus has been ruined, and when I hear you say it's a dead field, I think that that's something similar to what I had in mind. So anyway, so we changed the title of the lecture, and I changed the content of the lecture a little bit. But I hear what you're saying. I feel what you're saying very acutely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have a.
Thank you.
Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm John. 2 smart aleck comments and then a question. When you spoke of the need to study more the New Testament in Greek, I took that you implied we need to focus on Latin historical narratives from the Roman period about Jesus. Am I correct?
That's exactly what I had in mind. Thank you for putting words to that.
Second, is it possible that perhaps fewer undergraduates today are reading Hegel, and therefore they're not already coming with certain preconceptions to lead them into historical Jesus studies along 19th century lines?
That's possible, but I mean, my students in Northern California weren't reading Hegel either. They just bumped on stories about water becoming wine. Or bumped on stories about fish becoming more fish miraculously. So you don't have to read Hegel to come at that particular problem. The difference is the lived experience. If you're not experiencing Jesus on Sunday, then opening the pages of the New Testament don't make a whole lot of sense. They need to be interpreted in other words. But what I realized was the ways that I was interpreting Jesus were not very helpful. So.
There was a question among the women 3 or 4 rows back. Do you still have that question, or we've gone past it?
We want to make sure our WLI.
Yeah, any of the WLI folks have a question that you'd like to be sure to raise? Over here.
I just have a comment. As somebody who was raised unwittingly in a white privileged class and raised in a family of Roman Catholics that I ultimately rejected, in taking my first class on the Quran, I completely appreciated the new perspective and I welcomed it. And actually it clarified a lot of things that my faith that I learned had these questions that I just kept having. So I completely appreciated all that I learned of Jesus in the Quran, and actually did a paper on it. I would like to even learn more about it, because it just seemed to bring some clarity to some things that my faith did not answer. So I agree with you on the fact that we do need some different perspectives, and I would welcome even more, because what are we missing by not having these different perspectives? That's a rhetorical question, I guess.
This is a comment, right? This is an important comment. Thank you for your comment. At some point, I want to ask a question from Anthony.
Okay,
Right?
this would be a good time.
Is the quest of Jesus, would you describe this as a secularizing approach? As we find in Ernest Renan, for example, right? One of the early writers in the field. Was there an assumption to make Jesus a man and somewhat water down the divine aspect and maybe, I'm not questioning intentions, but making him more accessible and perhaps more relevant in a secular society? Would you say that that has been a feature of historical Jesus studies? And if that is the case, that partly would help us understand why the field is eclipsed, because the whole secularizing process has slowed down, right? It hasn't lived up to its promises as it was celebrated at the turn of the 20th century or in the middle of the 20th century, that religion is going to give way to civil religion and we don't need these miracle stories and things like that.
Yeah.
And I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, that's a very prominent thread. And I think that some people would argue that it's the dominant sort of fulcrum for the discipline, to try to move away from the creedal statements about Jesus and the creedal assumptions about Jesus, and try to sort of peel away the layers of faith and religion to arrive at some sort of history that doesn't have those biases. Now, I take a different view. I think that that's an important thread. I think that the older thread, and the thread that is more interesting to me, is that historical Jesus studies begins before the Enlightenment, long before the Enlightenment. It begins when anyone tries to set the record straight. Right? So we could almost call, the Gospel of Luke or Matthew the beginning of this, because we have the beginning of an attempt to set the record straight. You've heard this about Jesus, but if you really want to understand Jesus, this is this is, here's a different point of view, and here's a better point of view. And I think that this, in many cases, this can be found in Jewish-Christian relationships throughout the centuries, conversations between Jews and Christians about Jesus, and I'll admit that I just don't know enough about the relationship between Christianity and Islam in those early stages to know if those conversations are having as well. But I suspect that they are. Those conversations are there in that relationship as well.
Conversations are there, but this is 7 centuries after the inception of Christianity. Yeah. But the reason I ask this question, I want to use this as a segue to the historical Muhammad question. By peeling away faith and trying to arrive at a core of truth, nothing remains. Faith stories are not reducible to some historical fact. This is kind of, there is a joke in Persian that a man, there are many jokes about a person known as Mullah Nasruddin. The Turks call him the Hoja, Nasruddin Hoja, and Persians call him Mullah Nasruddin. He had lost his ring in his bedroom, and he had gone onto the street and was looking for it there. They said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm looking for my ring." They said, "Where did you lose it?" He said, "In my bedroom." He said, "Why are you looking for it here?" He said, "Because there is a light here, street lighting. My bedroom has no light." So trying to bring Jesus into the light of history and the very reductive, positivistic understanding of history that we have from the 19th century, and there are many people we can cite, is basically not, it leaves us with nothing. This is why Professor Awad would say it's a dead field, and you are saying that we are not going anywhere. We are probably, the 29 males are also aging. They're not just white and male, but most of them are probably also aging.
All of them are aging.
Yeah. So, see, I'm not a soothsayer, but I can imagine that is a discourse that has a lot of problems with it. The same thing with the work that was cited in Indiana. I know people there. There is an attempt to reduce Islam to its historical background, late antiquity. It is like reducing Jesus to the Roman period. If you want to do that, there is no Christianity, there is no Islam. The whole point of faith is not to reduce it to something else. I mean, philosophically, there's a very important point here. So when you say feeding 12 baskets of, correct me if I'm wrong,
no, that's
12
right.
baskets of fish and loaves of bread, this is simply a symbolic way of talking about the abundance that God gave. So maybe the story about, the narrative about Moses opening the sea was, he was just a clever guy. He knew about the time of the low tide. But this, as has been suggested, but this is not faith. This is an entirely different way of storytelling. This is reductive. And I want to say something because Professor Awad would, I'm sure, relate to this. There was an early Muslim school of thought called the Mu'tazilis. Right? The Mu'tazilis introduced this idea of interpretation. Interpretation, getting at the real meaning of things. And there is a phrase in the Quran that really attracted them. And the phrase is, after God created the world, he established himself on the throne. Established himself on the throne. Well, you would tell me, who speaks like this? Right? Sat on the throne. Right? But what does it mean for God to sit anywhere? Right? So the Mu'tazilis came along and said, well, sitting means he took charge. This is a symbolic way of talking about God being in full command. So when they saw a passage in the Quran that talked about God's hand, they said, well, this is about God's power. When they saw a passage about God seeing things, they said, this means God knows everything. But the Mu'tazilis kind of became irrelevant in Islamic history, intellectual history. Not because they were progressive, because that is what the Orientalists tell us, that they were rationalists in Islam. The Encyclopedia of Islam talks about them as the rationalists of Islam. No, they were reductive in their thinking, reducing the abundance, the giving of Jesus to just, God is giving, or the ascension of Muhammad to heaven as well, he had a connection with the high above. This obviates, this nullifies the mystery of faith. And if there is no mystery to faith, there is no faith, I think. And I'm not talking about stupid mystery. I'm talking about layered mystery, right?
I see a question here. I know Yehezkel has a question. There is one over here. Okay. So.
Make sense?
Very good. Yeah, very good.
My name is Muhammad Ijai. I hold a Master's of Divinity from Harvard, though a few years ago. I think it's important to center this conversation around power and the ways in which discourse about power is what shaped the study of religion. Yes, the religious being and the embodied of religion is an element of mystery, yes. At the same time, though, the mere study of religion and the language and the people who have studied it have constructed a paradigm that is rooted in disempowering some and privileging the few. 29 white men and 1 white woman is an act of violence against people of color. I mean, seriously, how can we expect to change the narrative if the people who have the experience and the intellectualism to shape that narrative aren't even in the room? And I don't think there's any of those people there. We're actively trying to keep them away, but that is a serious problem when they're not there. And so I just wanted to ask, even though, yes, systemically and conceptually, Jesus and all those figures transcend race in a way, the lived experience in generations of study of religion have in a way erased the humanity of such beings. And so how can we, in shaping the discourse, bring back what has been lost? And I actually wish you had titled this talk, How Jesus Was Ruined by Whiteness, because the reality is there was no whiteness, there was nothing, but that is the discourse, whether we like it or not, and we can't run away from it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important point, because even if race is a modern construct, it's a construct that we created and made real, right? And must live in and live with the consequences of. How do we change the violence, or the state of violence? I'm open to suggestions, because you just heard that it's a dead field, so does that really make you want to jump in? The question to my mind is, how do we make our field useful? How do we make our field, how do we make our field hospitable? And you're absolutely right that this is about power dynamics, because in a sense, what a journal is it's a formalized gatekeeping society, right? These people are gatekeepers that decide what's in and what's not.
So, Anthony, I'm going to cut you off there because MT has to leave and has a question. Yeah. Comment, yes. You have something to say.
Yes,
Thank you.
Well,
Does she have something
just to
Really?
wrap that up, the gatekeeping nature of a peer-reviewed journal is in many ways antiquated for a number of reasons, not just because of racial power dynamics, but of power dynamics of all sorts. But go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you have done and the work you're continuing to do.
Thank you.
I have this suggestion as one who has loved Jesus through the years, written and sung about Jesus, and I'm going off to talk about with my class again. For me, I suggest that we begin to move beyond something that's paradigm, into the realm of paradox. After all, the world in which we live is no longer Newtonian, it is quantum, and things just don't fit in frameworks. And the Jesus that has lasted this long and been a source of power and strength and spirituality and energy and love for so many in such diversity in different religions is a Jesus that doesn't fit in these frames. And I think what we find best about how to get more to the spirit and heart of this Jesus is to look to the stories. And where are those stories? They are with the little people. They are with the villagers. They are with the women around the fire in the cooking stove. They are where, you're sitting on the campfire at the end of the day or on a journey, and you tell these stories. I think we need to recover Jesus, the spirit of Jesus, and cherish the scholarship, but begin to try to recover the spirit and the reality of Jesus for the world in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Haskell has been, do you still have a question and comment? Yeah. Okay, yeah, but he's been waiting a really long time, and we'll come to you, I promise.
Thank you very much for this rich and stimulating conversation. Just 2 or 3 observations. And I echo the critiques that were made first by Dr. Kumali and then from people from the audience. Jesus always was a meta-historical figure. To reduce him, I'll use your language, to a historical figure distorts and maybe nullifies the whole essence of who Jesus is and remains in the consciousness of humanity across the planet. That's number one. So it's a lost cause. And it could be that white guys want to create they're either trying to maintain a white Jesus or they're arguing against it in polemical ways, but they have bought into a dichotomous polemic, because once you say, we're looking for the historical and not the meta-historical Jesus, you make a false distinction, a false binary. And I think that that's harmful, both to the reality of who Jesus was and remains, and for us as complex creatures who are both rationalist, would-be historians, and also people of faith. So that dichotomizing, I think, does a disservice to spirituality as well as history. And one other quick point about the Jewish Jesus.
Yes.
So, okay. That tells less rather than more. Say Jesus was Jewish is also a polemical statement today, because it's basically saying he wasn't a Christian, he remained Jewish until his last breath. Okay. So what? Because there were Judaisms, even in his time. People say he was taught by the Essenes in the desert. Rabbi Harvey Falk has a great book called Jesus the Pharisee, arguing he was a radical Pharisee. He wasn't an anti-Pharisee. So that's already a false binary. So these kinds of labels, which are being imposed not just on the past and trying to define them or explain them in 19th, 20th, 21st century categories, it's, I don't see any value in this, frankly. I hate to say this to your face. I like you.
Should I turn around?
And you're editing a journal. No, but I honestly, much more is lost than gained, it seems to me, in the whole enterprise.
I think I'm going to disagree with you on both points.
I hope you will.
But we don't have to belabor that. I'll just say 2 things. I think that Jesus was a historical figure, in addition to also being meta-historical. I don't want to lose that historical conversation. If for no other reasons, that like clockwork, and you can set your watch to it, about every 10 years, someone's going to suggest that Jesus was not just not Jewish, but he was anti-Jewish. And it's folks who study the historical Jesus who come along and say, no, that's not right. That's not right. And scholars have been trying to do that. I mean, the first person that I know of that argued that position was the professor of Rudolf Bultmann, Martin Kahler, who said, this historical business is irrelevant. All we have is the supranatural Jesus, the supra-historical Jesus. And that's a Jesus that's untethered. That's a Jesus that allows that context in Germany to do whatever they want with him, to turn him into an Aryan. And to say that Jesus was Jewish, I think that we can acknowledge that there were very many varieties of Judaism. If you're okay with that term, I would prefer Jewish life. I don't know if Judaism is anachronistic at that point or not. But I don't think that it's a reductionist statement, and I don't necessarily think that it is a polemical statement. I think it's an important premise that I'd like to maintain.
And I'm going to give the last word over
Hi, my name is Areej Al-Hamouli. I'm an Arabic teacher, and I also just started studying here at Harvard Seminary. The Baghdad Clock is a title of a book, and it was written by an Arabic author. It was translated into many languages. The book is about growing up in war and making friends with it. And the author was able to come after getting a visa and talk to us about the book, and she was bombarded with questions about the things that you talked about, methodology, how she chose the title, how she chose the narrative, how she's going to tailor her next book. And she just started crying on stage at Yale University because she described this all as a luxury. And our questioning of these kinds of things kind of diminished her experience. So I also have similar experiences where I walked into conference of the Middle East Studies Association, where a bunch of also non-diverse folks are talking about my experience in Cairo and how it was like during the Mubarak regime or during the revolution. And I remember feeling very marginalized, feeling like I am not really included, I basically walked out. I couldn't, stand hearing it. So I appreciated you talking about the Jesus barriers, and you mentioned that there was an interest in alternate narratives. I remember Choose Your Own Mystery or Choose Your Own Adventure books growing up. We loved to read them because we got to choose our own ending. And also how the methodology of the studying and the assumptions, and how people of color are just not interested in those things. They already know Jesus in the church. They already have learned what they needed to know. They're not interested in selling more books or doing all these things, and how this really, as you said, it pushes people of color out of the picture. So I think I kind of join my brother over here in asking what kind of things can we do to push us into the picture in a way that's meaningful to us. And that brings for a better dialogue.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think that is where we must leave it, but that's a very powerful place to leave it. Thank you so much for that, and thank you, all of you were great listeners and contributed much. Thanks to our two speakers, and...
May I say one last word?
The very last word.
To thank our guest.
Yes.
Because the way I understand it, by reading your book, your articles, you are trying to rescue the quest and making it relevant by acknowledging that whiteness is a problem. Whiteness has ruined Jesus' studies. Well, that I have no problem with. And thank you for bringing that to us. It is not enough to throw out some methodological point that, okay, everything is power relations. Of course. Any undergraduate student has learned that. The point is to talk about the specifics of power relations, not just a general observation of, methodology is this, methodology. And thank you for working the details. Thank you for taking the time to write this historical Jesus by going through example by example how these stories are created, what they are supposed to mean. How can we know? What do we know? What is knowing? What is the nature of historical evidence? Thank you very much for doing that.
And thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.